Hello friends, for today's video we're discussing the pros and cons of fandoms. First and foremost, a huge thank you to all of you for your input on this topic, as it is through your shared experiences that we're able to have a much more interesting, engaging, and well-rounded conversation than we would if we were just limited to my experiences with this. So again, a huge thank you to all of you. Also a huge thank you to Fable for partnering with me on today's video. If you're unfamiliar with Fable, it's essentially what if Goodreads actually put in effort to be better and enhance the user experience, as it is independently owned. It's made by people who love stories and who want to provide a tool for individuals who also love stories. The way it works is it is a book tracking app. Most of us are familiar with how those work, and what makes it a cut above is all of the individual tools that they have to offer. You can actually customize your home screen so that you can have the stats and everything appear to you in a way that feels more personal, as well as just in general having an interface that is more pleasant to the eye. As you update your reading, it also provides for you your own personal summary of what you tend to read, and this gets updated the more you read, so by the end of the year you can reflect on what you tend to read the most often. It also keeps track of things like the authors that you've read the most of. It has a breakdown of different genres as well as different mediums. It will show you books versus manga versus comics. And for those of you like myself who also love stories in other forms, you can also track the anime and the TV shows that you watch. One of my favorite features though, as somebody who loves to plan, and typically I write everything down and I go back through and reflect in my planner and my notebook, is they have this feature essentially built in. As you update what you're reading, it will show you daily reading streaks, and whenever you hit a new reading streak, it will tell you congratulations, read for 9 days straight, 10 days straight, whatever the amount can be. And as somebody who has a tendency to feel like I have to set aside all the time in the world to pick up a book as opposed to just reading a little bit here and there, this actually is motivating me to try and read more often. And it just looks really satisfying because it will show you the books that you have entered having read that day. You'll actually see the covers of those books on a calendar, and you can go back through and edit in case you've ever made any mistakes. So the stats feature, how customizable it is, and the reading streaks are definitely helpful in being really motivating. But also, if you are somebody who is looking to have a sense of community that is maybe separate from other things that are really big and feel like there's too much going on, you just kind of want to cut the fluff and stick to stories, they do have so many different clubs that you can either start or participate in. Currently, they have over 70,000 different clubs. You can search for these based off of genre and based off of language, which I think is an incredible feature. If you're a little daunted at the idea of having to re-update all of your book tracking, you can actually download all of your Goodreads data, and if you're somebody who does like to track the shows you watch, you can do the same thing with your Netflix page. So in a lot of ways, it's like taking the best pieces of Goodreads, Spotify, Instagram, and really condensing that all to be for people who love stories. And the fact that it is independently owned makes it so that it has much more of that small business feel, where it is the shared, we provide feedback and then they respond to that and continue to make the app better and better. Again, a huge thank you to Fable for partnering with me on today's video. Now on to your responses when it comes to the pros and cons of fandoms. The exact prompt for this said, "To fandoms from readers, please stop," as well as "more, please. What aspects of fandoms and fandom culture are you appreciative of? Are there any, or do you find the cons of fandoms outweigh the pros? What are the cons in your opinion? As a fun side note, which fandom was the worst you've interacted with and which was the best?" I actually really quick just want to say, having gone through so many of your responses, that the number one fandom that was listed as the worst was the Star Wars fandom. And this is part of why I wanted to say thank you for your input, because this is not a fandom that I'm a part of. I have some tangential awareness of this fandom just as a part of being within science fiction and fantasy spaces, but I have not really interacted with this fandom before. I don't really pay that much attention to it, but time and time again, so many of you listed this as the worst fandom. I think the only other one that I saw mentioned with the same level of vitriol was the League of Legends fandom, which I have heard, as somebody who is a huge fan of video games and a huge fan of Arcane, I have heard that the League of Legends fandom is absolutely horrendous, especially when it comes to gatekeeping, and just in general they're really aggressive and really mean while people are actually playing the games. So those are the two that got brought up the most often. you will see these brought up as I read through your responses, which we'll jump into now. Kicking it off, Maya says, I'm very appreciative of the Malazan Book of the Fallen fandom. It's my favorite series, but it's a long read. I couldn't convince anyone around me to read the whole series, but in the fandom, I have people who, like me, not only read, but reread, and I can discuss the epic story in whole. I think this is so exciting to see because not that long ago, most of the time when people brought up this fandom, it was with a sense of negativity, as the bad apples in that fandom really give the fandom a bad rap. I myself have noted that I do find that the bad apples in that fandom tend to be among some of the most condescending, just based in the very nature of how this book series is made up. It is very long. It's not necessarily very streamlined. And oftentimes there is this purposeful withholding of information to create suspense, to kind of force the reader to pay close attention and to, in some ways, almost have this sense of community. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about fandom is when you have a story that's giving you bits and pieces, is the way people come together to try and puzzle everything out before they have the story as a whole. Then when they do have the story as a whole, they can go back and discuss, they can get really excited about what they got right, what they got wrong, but then also it makes the rereading factor, like Maya talked about, that much more exciting because then you can see which pieces were there all along. However, along the way, oftentimes people are a little adrift, we'll say, and as a result, some people, they don't like that feeling. Some people have valid criticisms for the idea of that purposeful withholding of information, because there is a difference between not holding someone's hand versus I'm going to try to make things cloudy. It is a purposeful device, I think, but also it is not to everybody's liking, and I think it's very fair to say I just can't engage with the story on the same level that I can with other stories, because I prefer when there is this very deep character development that is delivered to us in a way that is more actually how you connect with real human beings in real life. And there's just all these interesting conversations that can be had, but it gets, unfortunately, zeroed in on the whole idea of you just don't get it, or people who don't like the series are just impatient. They want their hands held, and there is this sort of patronizing tone towards people who don't like it, but again, only by a select few. Most of the time, the people who love this series are just so excited that somebody else wants to read it, and they genuinely want to ensure that you have a good time with the series, that they're there to answer those questions, but that is a very different experience. It almost relies in some ways on fandom, because I know a lot of people who get into Malazan end up having to go to the internet, or they have to take copious amounts of notes just to get through the series. Again, it is an experience for the people that do choose to go through all the way, and for some people it's worth it, some it's not. But I'm glad to see that I think so many more people are starting to have positive experiences with this. And I do want to say, I feel like people like my friend Petrick, if you don't know Petrick, he has his own book channel. He is very well versed when it comes to so many things to do with fantasy. But I feel like he's a perfect example of somebody who is as nice as can be, as welcoming as can be, and who has a genuine love and passion for not just that series, but so much of fantasy. So again, so excited to see that this is, I feel like, turning a new leaf, because in the past, there's some pretty negative experiences, which actually I did see some people note, so we'll get to that later. Next up, Megan says, a pro would definitely be being able to share my love for something with other people who also love it. Being able to talk about theories or why we love something is great. A con would always be the people who argue with others who have different opinions or interpretations than them. The people who say, here's why you're wrong, and things like that. I can't think of the worst fandom I've interacted with, but I can say the best ones are usually the smaller fandoms. Everyone is just so happy to have new people to talk to, that people are usually much more civil. And I think this is probably not really needing to be said, but of course, when something is smaller, there is this, oh my gosh, I found somebody else who likes this too. And then in that scenario, you're going to probably geek out over the things that you're excited about. But then when the other person offers up different thoughts and feelings and theories about things, I feel like there's more of an excitement about it, because there's more of a, wow, I never even thought of it like that. And I suppose in a sense, this entire video is like, can I get more people to get into Witch Hat Atelier? Because a lot of you know I love Witch Hat Atelier. I think it's criminally underhyped. But that is one where there are a couple theories out there, and it is so exciting. It's exciting in a way that I haven't experienced in a really long time, and it's that aspects of fandom that I think are so fun. But what's very different about that small space, like what Megan is discussing here, is that when you do find somebody discussing their theories, it is coming genuinely from a place of just being so thrilled to explore something and then just throw that out there for whoever else sees it and finds it and wants to discuss it. And I won't say too much about it, but on the note of Witch Hat Atelier, the tree theory is one of my favorite theories I've come across in anything. I didn't come up with it, but when I saw it, I was like, okay, I'm fully on board. I cannot wait to see more of this story unfold, which I was already excited to see more of the story unfold because I love Witch Hat Atelier. But now I'm like, is this theory right? And I think a lot of us have experienced that when it comes to books, and not necessarily with this manga series, but when it comes to books, I think a lot of us have experienced this with the Cosmere as an example. And yes, it can be so, so fun. And the Cosmere has been mentioned a number of times, not just from these responses, but just over the years. As somebody who's a Cosmere fan, a lot of people are very open about their positive and negative experiences with the fandom. As it's exploded and gotten so much bigger, there are some negative experiences that I have had myself and that other people have vocalized before when it comes to just, you throw a theory out there and it gets shot down. And what's funny is when maybe more credibility is starting to form, the more that books are released, suddenly that person is treated very different than they were in the past. And it's disheartening that people can be like that. But I do agree that, unfortunately, the larger something gets, that small minority of people who are negative and who are gatekeeping in a lot of ways, that just increases as well, which tends to result in it seeming like a louder force. Whereas when it's smaller, everybody's just happy to be there. This next one is a little bit longer. Emily says, like Megan, I am grateful to fandoms that allow people to come together as a group and community and appreciate all aspects of the piece of media. A bad thing that can come out of some fandoms is that because there are many different ways one can become a fan of a work, a book, a movie, a TV adaptation, etc., some fans can be opinionated on what you should consume to be a true fan. This can pressure new fans into feeling what they like isn't valid or real. For example, I grew up watching the 2003 anime adaptation of Fullmetal Alchemist and became a fan of it through that medium. However, I may have felt pressured by others within the fandom who insisted that this adaptation wasn't any good because it is less accurate when compared to the more recent anime adaptation Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. The manga was fully completed when Brotherhood was created compared to the original anime adaptation. Or a person who watched a movie adaptation of a book series that made them a huge fan, but people within the same fandom told them that they had to read the books to be a real fan. If someone is a fan of something regardless of how they were first introduced to it, people within the fandom should not shame them or insist that what they consumed was bad or wrong. They should just be happy that others like and appreciate it too. I think this is especially prevalent in probably more so things like Marvel and DC, because book adaptations, I do find that a lot of times when something is adapted, it's not always, there are exceptions of course, but it's not necessarily always as mainstream as other stories are, like the superhero movies that we see. So people who get really into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, DC, if they get into it through the cartoons that they watched growing up, or if they get into it through the films that are out, and now the plethora of shows that exist around it, if they get into it through that, I do think sometimes there is this feeling of, well, what is being described here by Emily, you're not a true fan because the true fans know based off of the comics. And also, even if you do get into the comics, then there is this additional factor of, okay, well, you read this one individual's run, now you got to go back and read this because you're not going to know what they're referencing here, why what they're doing here is so interesting and different and unique because the original character in this comic, and then it can just kind of be this constant moving of the line of what it means to be a real fan. At the beginning, I mentioned that some individuals pointed out how awful the League of Legends fandom can be, and I felt like after season 1 of Arcane, I wasn't seeing as much of this, I think because of the fact that Arcane actually had so much of a low expectation. Nobody really knew what to think of that, and when it popped up on people's radars and they watched it, everyone thought, this has no reason to be as good as it is. What's going on? And there's the additional factor of the fact that they actually created new characters and new plot lines for that show. Then when season 2 came out and they were starting to do a lot more really fun integrations of nods to the League of Legends, then that's when I felt like I saw a lot more League of Legends fans coming out and mocking people who maybe didn't know that something was going to come out. I think a really specific example is that there's a character who gets this really interesting design later on. I don't want to say too much in case you haven't watched Arcane, but they get this really interesting design. And apparently the design is a little bit different in League of Legends. And there were so many people that were upset that it didn't look like that, which is fair. If you like one over the other, that's okay. But then other people who only had watched the show were saying, I think it's cool. And then there was this whole like, well, of course you think it's cool because you're not a real fan who knows what it's actually supposed to look like. This, of course, wasn't stated by everybody, but I did see those kinds of clashes online. And I was like, this is silly. Why are we? This is, okay, some people like it, some people don't. Some people don't have a frame of reference. Okay, let's move on. I feel like it's as simple as that. But I do agree that unfortunately there is this constant having to prove why you're a true fan, and what it even means to be a true fan is always up in the air and ever moving. Mark's comment is so nice. It made me so happy. It says, I'm new to reading fantasy, and I find that fandoms introduce me to book series I find to enjoy, like the Greenbone Saga. That's so nice. I think that that's absolutely lovely when we're obviously discussing so many of the cons and the negatives. It's just so nice and refreshing to see that fandoms can really spark that excitement and help lead people to other new stories to love. That's really great. That makes me so happy. The next one is finally talking about the Star Wars fandom. It says, the worst fandom I've ever interacted with is the Star Wars fandom. When The Force Awakens came out, I saw an article title that named an actor who appears as a stormtrooper in a scene. I commented that it was a spoiler and that I wish they hadn't posted the name of the actor in the title of the article. Then I got a bunch of nasty reply comments about how a cameo didn't count as a spoiler, and I just said I disagreed with them. Then someone commented about the biggest moment in the movie and said, that's a spoiler. Thankfully, I had gone to see the movie that day and didn't see the comment until after I got out of the theater, but I thought it was such a mean thing to do. That is a really mean thing to do. People that go out of their way to spoil things for people for no reason other than just, I guess, they're miserable. I don't understand why people would do this. I guess I just answered it because they're miserable and misery loves company. It feels too simplistic to say that, but what a stupid thing to do. And also just being like, I thought a cameo was a spoiler, and somebody deciding like, well, let me mess everything up for you. It's so childish. And also, I don't understand. Do you think that makes you more of a fan? I just don't understand the justification for why anyone would do that. This next one also quite long. It says, I generally don't actively contribute to fandoms myself, but I think fandoms can have a lot of really creative, transformative works, which can be a really fun way to explore new dimensions of the original pieces of media. On the other hand, I don't enjoy shipping or theorizing much, which I think is why I don't tend to get super into fandoms. I think also in general fantasy spaces like our fantasy, there can be a bit of push and pull between people who are fans in a particular fantasy fandom, Stormlight fans, Malazan fans, etc., and people who are fans of fantasy in general instead of being in a particular fandom. Ones who read more new releases from debut authors, try to find hidden gems, read works that aren't popular enough to have a fandom, etc. The fandom fantasy fan tends to really want to evangelize their favorite series, often by recommending it in inappropriate places without any self-awareness, and the general fantasy fan just to stop hearing about the same series over and over again. I think on YouTube, this shows more as creators who only create content if they know a fandom will respond to it positively or negatively, versus ones that at least sometimes talk about books that don't really have a following. I don't blame YouTubers who go the first route. I mean, they get more money and attention for doing it. It makes sense. But personally, I enjoy and respect creators who go the second route, which if Elle is reading this, I think she does. Thank you. That's very nice. I don't disagree with a lot of the negatives that have already been stated. Negatives that I know we're going to get to, and also some of the things that are being discussed here. When there are people who are really huge fans of a specific popular series, I have absolutely seen the exact things that are being discussed. I've even had a video before where I said something to the effect of, sometimes we're very unhelpful, meaning those of us who do maybe have a love for some of those more popular works, and what was discussed here about how people with no self-awareness will just recommend things even if it doesn't make any sense. I have seen this very thing before, in that sometimes people can ask, hey, do you have any recommendations for books that are, and they'll ask for certain criteria, or they'll say, I just read this book, really enjoyed it. Here are the reasons why I enjoyed it. What else would you recommend? And almost without fail, someone will say the very two things that this individual stated, which would be Stormlight and Malazan, which is it's baffling because Malazan is not easy to get into, as we discussed at the start. And Stormlight Archive, those books are all over 1,000 pages. It's a huge undertaking. The further into the series you get, the more and more it is recommended that you also read all the other series so that you have a full understanding of what's being talked about just within that series. And when I say all the other series, I'm referring to all the other series in the Cosmere because it is a greater universe. So it's an undertaking, and people will say something like, I really enjoyed Eragon or something. I'm just throwing out one that I wouldn't say there's a direct one-to-one comparison, but somebody will just throw out, hey, I read this, I read Eragon, what should I read next? And someone will be like, I really think you would enjoy Malazan. And you're like, how did you get there? And they won't even really elaborate. They'll just be like, it's really great and it's epic. And you're like, okay, I need a little more than just that you liked it. It's got to be more than that. And I get it to some degree because when you love something passionately, you just want to bring it up all the time. And I'm really refraining from giving a specific example because I don't want to do the thing that I am discussing right now. But there is a story that on this book channel I talk about all the time, and it's not a book, and I bring it up constantly. And also when I do, if you like this, try that, sometimes I'm like, I know it's not a book, but everybody should try this. And again, I'm not going to say it, but if you know, you know. So I understand that there is just that feeling of, I love this, and it stems from something kind of nice. You love it because it really moved you and it really impacted you, and you want other people to have that experience. So at the end of the day, it is coming, I think, from a place of kindness. However, sometimes it's not what people are looking for, you know? So I do agree that I think there is an element of maybe read the room. Is that what they asked for? No? Okay, well then maybe look at what they're asking for and recommend them something based off of that. As for individuals who maybe lean more into fandom versus ones who try to have a little bit of a fuller range, it just depends on, for me, the level of authenticity. I think if somebody is continuously making fandom content because they really love that and that's pretty much all they want to talk about, then I think that's great. Talk about the thing that you're passionate about. That's going to draw in other individuals who are passionate, and that's going to create a really welcoming and exciting community. However, yes, as always, there are people who just do things because it's popular, and I think it's really notable when somebody taps into a really popular fandom and then all of a sudden they happen to fall in love with this other thing that is also exceptionally popular, and then, oh, what do you know? They also are falling in love with this other thing that's really popular, and then if they happen to fall in love with something that's maybe not as mainstream, it's still really popular among the fans of these other things. So it's just kind of this continuous feedback loop of, look, I like this thing that you like, so don't you like me? Well, now that you like me, I'm just going to say whatever you like, so you keep liking me, so you'll keep watching my videos. And that's when I kind of start to question how much a person really, because every now and then I'm like, really? All these things that are pretty well liked within these groups, you happen to really love all of these and really want to make a lot of videos about all of them? I don't know if I believe you. I think it's, and when, you know, maybe they get into something and they're like, yeah, I liked it. And then they realize it's really, really well loved. And then they're like, I think I have to give it another try. And then they do give it another try. And suddenly they just realize how brilliant it is the second go around. I don't love that. But I try to give people benefit of the doubt, you know. But sometimes it's a little suspicious. The absolute worst is fandoms that can't take criticism of their favorite work and have to argue with it whenever they see it. I especially hate it when the criticism is someone critiquing sexism and the response is trying to trick people into thinking that sexism isn't that bad or even isn't there at all. The Dresden Files fandom is the worst at this. Dresden Files fans who are aware of the sexism and understand why this makes some people not want to read it are the best. Unfortunately, they seem to be a really small part of the fandom. Kingkiller Chronicles also do this a lot, but I've had a greater than 50% chance of getting Kingkiller fans to at least respect where I'm coming from, even if they don't 100% agree with it. But again, the ones who can't be convinced are the absolute worst, and having long debates with them can get annoying. There's also the Malazan fandom, where I've gotten fans who call me condescending for daring to suggest that their favorite series should never be recommended to someone who specifically asks for books without assault in them because Malazan has graphic assault scenes. Malazan fans can also be extremely pretentious in a really annoying way. The only way you don't like Malazan is if you are too dumb. You actually need authors to spoon feed you, hold your hand. People who critique Erickson's characterizations are babies who just aren't educated enough to get why he's so great. Something Erickson himself has said, which I'm sure didn't help. Again, there's definitely cool Malazan fans who just love the series and generally want to welcome new readers, but the trend of dismissing any critiques of people who genuinely did not enjoy the series because of those who are just dumb is the worst. Next up, I definitely appreciate the existence of fandoms. I don't have many people in my life who share the same hobbies, and if they do, they don't have the same passion as I do. I am a wallflower in life and online, and so it's just nice to be able to go online, find discussion posts or videos about whatever interests me or questions I want answered, and then go on about my day. For example, I was watching a theory video for Stormlight. I'm not going to say the specifics here because I don't want for anybody who's unfamiliar to have anything even potentially revealed. But basically they were watching something about the Starlight Archive and they brought up a theory and they read a post. They thought it was really cool. They really wanted it to be true, and then they moved on. In terms of cons, it can be pretty toxic and some people can be really like scary delusional. I've been reading manga and watching animes for over a decade, and over the years you just hear the craziest stuff. Like, people, please, it's a piece of fiction. Let's just take a deep breath and rein it in. This next one is relatively brief, but I'm going to use it as a jumping off point into something much larger. It says, these aren't fantasy or even bookish, but the best fan in my experience is the Babylon 5 fandom back in the day, hands down, bar none. The most toxic has been the Star Wars fandom with its racism and misogyny. So evidently another tick in the column of the Star Wars fandom is apparently the worst. That's really exciting that the Babylon 5 fandom had such a lasting impression and that it was such a positive experience for you. So that's really wonderful. But the thing that I wanted to jump into from this is you would think that most people, if they have a love for something, their love for that would lead them to want other people to find it and discover it and love it too. It's the thing that we were talking about before, where when somebody maybe talks about something too much, where you're thinking, okay, somebody asked for a recommendation that had XYZ in it, and you listed something that is completely different. Maybe now's not the moment, but we talked about how usually that's because they just love it so much and they want other people to love it too. But what often doesn't make sense to a lot of us and feels like very contradictory behavior is when somebody evidently loves something and then they are so rude, condescending, and belittling to anybody who seems to be new coming into the space. And we all think that doesn't make any sense. Don't you want people to find and discover this? Why are you pushing people away? And I think that what causes this is often rooted in what led somebody to become so connected with a work of art in general. Oftentimes, works that are really meaningful to us are really meaningful because they make us feel seen, they make us feel heard, and perhaps they came to us at a time that was really, really terrible in our lives. So then we hold on to that, and we're very grateful to whatever story it was. In this instance, we'll use the example of a book series. Let's say it's a book series that's not necessarily mainstream, but it is something that a lot of people are starting to find in almost a cult following kind of way. So when you find it and you come to it, you finally feel seen again, and then when you find other people that like it, you kind of all collectively together, because of that sort of close-knit feeling, have each other's backs in a sense. And then when it starts to become more mainstream, if the thing that led you to feel really put down, if in some ways this was due to behavior from other people, then when it starts to feel like the story is getting mainstream, it no longer has a cult following, but it has this immense popularity, it almost can feel like these people over here that caused me pain, they don't deserve to get to have this thing. This is the thing, this was the balm to the pain that they caused me. They don't deserve to get to have this too. And the thing that doesn't make any sense, unfortunately, is because any bit of self-reflection would make the individual realize that they are now becoming the very kind of person that maybe led them to be in a dark place in their life. They are now becoming the bully. So I wish more people would reflect on how that behavior can lead other people to this place of negativity. Certainly there are people that are just entitled and rude, and maybe nobody was ever unkind to them, and they are just somebody who needs a reality check, maybe, to put it politely. But the other part of this that is frustrating is that the example I'm giving of maybe somebody made you feel put down and you felt isolated and seen as other in some way. Maybe as an example, the popular kids in high school made you feel bad and bullied you, and that's why you found this particular work of art. So anybody that you start to deem as fulfilling in your mind that stereotype of like the popular kid in high school, if somebody even represents that a little bit, you've decided, even if they weren't people who caused you pain, even if they weren't people who you literally knew, you just kind of associate them with those people, there's like this block in your mind, then you're just becoming somebody who puts people in boxes, and you don't recognize that there's nuance, you don't recognize that these people that are coming into it aren't the same people that caused you pain years ago. You're just sort of, once again, you're becoming the very person that led you to that dark place. That's my assessment anyway. I wish more people would really be more introspective about why they're so possessive of something as opposed to wanting to share something that is apparently, evidently, really moving, really beautiful, really impactful. Why would they not want to share that with other people? I wish more individuals would ask themselves that. Next up, Michael says, so I don't really participate in any fandoms at all. That's just not my sort of thing in my old age, especially because I developed an allergy to certain kinds of interactions. As a remark suggests, there are a few things I would say, not all of them positive. First, it's always great in theory, sometimes in practice, to have a forum where like-minded people can discuss things they love, and the digital age has made these communities possible in a way previous eras could not have dreamed. Maya, somebody who had made a note earlier, is right not only about finding people in our day-to-day lives to undertake vast series like Malazan with us, but about books more generally and in a really profound way. That Atlantic article everyone's talking about is old news for those of us who teach college English. Many undergraduates can't read whole books, and book talk platforms among virtuous actors, readers who complain about books having too many words. It's enough to make an old lit professor cry. Given these situations, book/author fandoms have double value. They are creating a social context that encourages the act of reading itself, not just community. Reading is the prerequisite for joining. That much is absolutely to the good. But we don't always get to have nice things. From what I have seen and heard, some fandoms, I won't put any on blast here, are a little too much like middle school. They seem to create little subculture hierarchies in which people once ostracized as dorks get to establish a pecking order where they sit at the top and replicate the kind of social gatekeeping they experience themselves. Okay, so you just summarized everything I was trying to say, and you did it in a much more eloquent way. So thank you to you. To be mean, condescending, and exclusive rather than welcoming and inclusive. I have heard wonderful things about the Malazan fandom and some others as well. I have heard really appalling stuff about some others, especially from women on BookTube, which brings me to a final point I'd want to make. So much of this gatekeeping and hierarchy seems to be created by men. The women on BookTube I've seen describing awful experiences with self-appointed mages, sorry, that's really funny, is chilling, especially given larger correlates in the culture. I write this 2 days before the election. If you couldn't tell, obviously, I asked this question quite a few months before. Turns out my wishes for fandoms mirrors my wishes for society. More respect and kindness and acceptance. No one should be willing to be unkind to anyone else over an imaginary world. If misogyny and bigotry are what you have to offer a group you belong to, you need to get a life. Reading the thread here, this seems to be a common theme. Before expanding on that, I actually feel like Sue's comment goes hand in hand with what Michael was just saying. It says, fandoms for me have provided a way to make connections with people when otherwise I might find it difficult. Like many, I've always been a bit of an outsider. I see this sentiment echoed in other comments of being a female who has enjoyed video games for decades and sci-fi and fantasy. Although interestingly, in the online anonymous world, I haven't always led with being a woman because that has often led to some negative experiences in those same places. I'm glad to see now though that this is lessening at last for women, thinking especially of MMO gaming. And this is something that unfortunately I think a lot of people have experience with, where because of the very nature of who they are, if they enter a group of people where maybe something about them is different from the majority, that just instantly, apparently for some people, is enough to insist that they don't belong in that fandom. You'll also see oftentimes, if you ask the very kinds of people I'm giving as an example, the ones who maybe don't necessarily fit the traditional mold, when they go into certain fandom spaces, likely they have had to go out of their way to quote unquote prove that they're a real fan, because there's just this idea that they can't possibly be because they don't fit into the mold, which is such a limited way of thinking. And also, to me, it never really makes much sense unless you really dig deep into someone's psyche and why they are the way they are, and then we start talking about society as a whole. But on a surface level, I always am confused by this, because to me, if there is a work that is drawing in so many different people from so many different walks of life, that means that that's something special, that we are able to come together through this one work. And of course, as I want to do whenever I do these more long format discussion style of videos, I at some point end up mentioning the fact that I majored in music. But I think music, maybe because it's an unspoken thing, but, well, in the kind of music, because I majored in music, specifically violin, so I played in a lot of orchestras. Obviously, there's a lot of music that involves singing, but I just mean that when you're developing a certain skill and then you join together, if you're playing with people in a chamber orchestra, if you're playing with somebody in a quartet, it is about coming together to create a beautiful piece of music. And Luna has thoughts too, apparently. I don't know if you just heard her, but it's about coming together with these shared skills that you have all developed individually, that you've poured years of your life enhancing. So then you come together and you can do something greater than a single part, something that you couldn't do alone. You come together to create something not only that creates for an amazing experience just in the playing of that music together, but also then when you get to share that music with other people, you are moving other people in really, really profound ways. And that's such a unifying thing. Obviously, music can have a lot of other things involved with the creation of the music. I mean, something very interesting that you learn about in music history is the way that music has been used for propaganda purposes and other such things. But there is something about it that it just feels like it transcends. And oftentimes, books are a little bit more forward and blunt about commentary on society, which I think is why it creates for a lot of sometimes heated debates, but sometimes really fantastic conversations. However, there is something sometimes that I think is, of course, separate from the kinds of effects that music can have. However, I think that music, I've seen how people coming together, it creates for something amazing. And it just makes me so sad that for some reason the differences that we have are the very things that we use as weapons against each other, just so that we can claim ownership over a piece of art. It's remarkably stupid. Luna grunted. She agrees. Next up is actually something that is tying into the idea of having this feeling of ownership and entitlement over something just because you love it, except for it's really getting into the specifics with that. I'm so glad that this was brought up. This might not be what you're looking for, but I wish fandom would stop supporting piracy. There's often a weird entitlement to art and justification of piracy, which especially hurts book authors. The justification is, quote, books shouldn't be only for the elite and my library is bad. There are online fan communities facilitating piracy and advocating for piracy as a way of sticking it to the man, but who do you think the man is? Certainly not this self-published author trying to sell copies and build themselves as an author. I remember a Tumblr post by Maggie Stiefvater diving into her experience with this. I used to be pro-piracy, but that post changed my mind. People also get very up in arms when creators assert their copyright and TM rights and generally don't understand how that works. A perfect example of this, I think, that we've seen, unfortunately, and it's not even to do with books, but with the Ghibli or Ghibli, depending on how you say it, the Studio Ghibli art filter, I'll call it, and that's putting it politely, but I saw a lot of people were like, no, it's fine that I'm doing this because I love Ghibli. My cat's name is Howl, and I wish I was kidding. That was a real thing I saw. A person was justifying it because they're like, guys, everybody just needs to be nicer. My cat's name is Howl. I obviously like Studio Ghibli. And I was just like, okay, but no, that's not, you liking a work does not mean that, well, it unfortunately currently there are no repercussions for you not having principles. But regardless, while maybe legally you're allowed to do it, I also think this is a scenario where I'm like, I think people can politely tell you that what you're doing is wrong. And you shouldn't be like, guys, come on, my cat, though, its name is Howl. The point being what you've described, which is that just because you like something does not mean that suddenly you have ownership over the art itself. You have ownership over how the art made you feel. If you are a fan of something, you do not own the rights to that work. The person who created it still deserves to be compensated. And also, how lucky are we to have people that create art for our enjoyment and are willing to share that with us, likely for honestly pennies. So many people hardly make anything out of what they put out into the world, and they're doing it because they love it. I'm just gonna get into a whole other thing about how I hate AI art and people that don't have any appreciation for art, and that's a whole other conversation, so we'll move on. Next up, this one, I forgot about this one. You introduced me to a new word, and I don't know how I've never come across it, because when I looked it up, I was like, oh, I'm familiar with this concept. I've just never seen this word, and I really like it. I'm probably going to say it wrong. I did that thing that I feel like people of a certain age do these days, where they're like, how do I pronounce this? What's the Urban Dictionary definition? So I'm sorry if I say it wrong. But anyway, please stop woobifying every character in sight, usually the male ones. It's so silly and unnecessary and often betrays some underlying well-meaning internalized misogyny. Also, it's just annoying when the entire appeal of a character is that he's horrible. That being said, I think fandom has more pros than cons. I love being able to discuss the stories I love with other people, love seeing fan art and reading fan fictions, etc. It's so much fun, and because of so much of it being online, I can always block out most of the annoying parts. Next up, dear fandom, not everything needs to be shipped, but if someone does ship something you don't, scroll down and move on with your life. Next up, stop creating AI-generated fan art, edits, worldscapes, etc. to promote a series on social media platforms. It is the utter opposite of creativity and supporting original art. I see this the most, I would say, with the Sarah J. Maas fandom and the Fourth Wing fandom. I see so much hideous mid-journey AI art. I'm calling it hideous because all AI art is. I see so much of it, and I'm always just kind of like, what are you all doing? What the thousands of people following this? You need that strongly to see a depiction of this hot guy over and over and over again. You need to see a depiction of a hot woman with her hair it grays and then goes white at the bottom. You really need to see that? Why? You don't love the work enough? There aren't enough of you that love the work and get to geek out together that you have to just look into AI art. If you're confused, there's a part of me that's like, I don't know. I don't understand how you can think that this is okay if you're supposedly a fan of art. It will never make sense to me. Next up, this one touches on some heavier topics. It says, I am very put off when fandoms tell me I didn't understand the book when I either dislike it or find some elements objectionable. I understand just fine. Not every person likes every book. I find in classic fantasy especially that unfortunately there are some male fans who can get very aggressive if female fans don't like things like gratuitous assault and fridging scenes. It's very likely that female readers are reminded too much of real life events and experiences and the lack of accountability for them, and in the time the book was written, it was a symptom that things back then were even worse. This is something that I've seen this occur time and time again. I think an example would be something like the manga series Berserk. This is known to be a very, very dark series. I've heard fantastic things about the characterization in that series. It has inspired things that I really, really love. For example, I'm a huge fan of the video game Elden Ring. I know the creator is very much inspired by a lot of the creations within that manga series, Berserk. So certainly it's had an impact. Also, the art is phenomenal. The art is absolutely amazing. However, I personally have no interest in checking out that series because I know that there is a significant amount of assault within it. It's also a visual medium, so it is shown sometimes for pages and pages and pages. And there are aspects to that I can understand why somebody would feel in some ways, like, this is depicted the way it is because it's a horrible thing and people need to understand how horrible it is. I understand that side of things. I also completely understand when people feel like they just don't want to have to look at that time and time again, because it happens a number of times. However, there's actually somebody who is a fan of the series, a huge fan. I think it's their favorite series. They're a huge fan of it, and they themselves had an article about how this is their biggest criticism, is how often they fall back on this as a plot device, and sometimes centered around the same character. And they got so many other people, fans of the series, so angry and upset with them, and then those people were saying absolutely horrible things to them for this. And I think this is just sort of a perfect representation of what you're describing here, of if somebody knows for themselves, I personally don't want to engage in that because it's very much something that people have, unfortunately, experiences with, sometimes some of the most traumatizing experiences of their life, or they know somebody who experienced that, and they just do not want to have to see that and read about it because it's so difficult. I don't understand. I've even seen some people say, Berserk is for everybody. And I'm like, okay, nothing is for everybody. Some people aren't going to like stuff. That's fine. Let them just not pick it up. Let them not pick it up. That's okay. And of course, that's not the only series. And this specific topic isn't the only instance. There are plenty of other horrific things that occur that some people just don't want to pick up. And I think that in general, fandoms can be a little more understanding of that. Next up. Okay, stop calling criticisms toxic. Stop using terms like bigotry, ism, and phobia to deflect criticism. There's been a lot of hot garbage coming out of Hollywood and a lot of hot garbage games being developed. The obsession to defend laziness because it aligns with your beliefs and ideals, even though these movies and games are appealing to the most shallow caricature versions of said beliefs and ideals, makes no sense to me. You come off as disingenuous. You are not a fandom. You're a fandom hater. Also, League of Legends has the most toxic fandom player base out of any game by far, and Disney adults are the most cringe. I don't really have anything to say about the Disney adults thing because that's not my wheelhouse. I don't really know anything about Disney adults. So I'm going to focus on the bulk of what you were talking about. I personally am of the mindset that if a criticism is entirely rooted in racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, or bigotry in some fashion, I don't care whatsoever if it is called that. So it is interesting that you mentioned this in reference to games being developed, because I don't know how any of us would know anything about the games if they're currently being developed and we haven't had the chance to play them. But I think a perfect example of what I just described is people who are upset because the new Ghost game has a female protagonist and the new Witcher game features Ciri as the protagonist. Anybody who's read the books, which the games are a what-if scenario for after the books, if you've read the books, at some point, Ciri actually does, despite the fact the Witcher books are called The Witcher, and thus you would more so associate that with Geralt. Within the books, Ciri actually does start to sort of steal the spotlight and become more so the protagonist of that. And within The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt, we do see a very satisfying conclusion to Geralt's story, and it very much is setting up Ciri as the protagonist. So it makes sense that we would now see Ciri as the protagonist within The Witcher 4. Thus, when people are upset, genuinely upset that Ciri is the protagonist, and they're upset either because they don't feel that she is hot enough, or they're upset because they don't like playing video games with a female protagonist, those don't feel like real criticisms at the game. Those feel centered in sexism. When it comes to the new Ghost game, I have to say I witnessed one of the funniest evolutions of an argument that I've ever seen because it's so straight off the point. If you don't know, if you are not a gamer, Sucker Punch developed the game Ghost of Tsushima, which in my opinion is absolutely phenomenal. One of my favorite games in so many different ways. They have a spin-off that is going to be coming out that has a female lead. It takes place, I believe, around 300 years later than Ghost of Tsushima. Thus why you don't have the same protagonist. We don't really know all that much about this protagonist or her mission, what she's doing, but it looks like it's going to be just as beautiful as Ghost of Tsushima. I am very, very excited. I don't know with certainty that it's going to be good, but it looks good, and if it's anything like the first, I am very, very excited about it. However, as soon as Sucker Punch announced this, their comments were flooded with people who were upset that the protagonist was a woman. I understand if you miss Jin from Ghost of Tsushima. I understand if you miss Geralt from the Witcher series. Both of these are iconic characters, especially Geralt. Both of these are phenomenally written characters, especially in the situation of Jin, which he was not somebody who had a story already from any kind of a book series. He was created for this game. His story is amazing. So I understand missing these characters. I understand wanting more of them. However, if you are just genuinely upset that there is a woman protagonist, that is sexism. That's not a criticism of the game whatsoever, especially because you can't even criticize the game. It's not out. As you said, this is something in development, so you can't really have firm criticisms. If the game sucks, I'll say, wow, this was a huge letdown. I'm so upset. I was really hopeful for this. But getting back to the way that this one conversation devolved is somebody said, for Ghost of Tsushima specifically, they said Ghost of Tsushima is an RPG. If you don't know what that stands for, it stands for role-playing game. They said it's an RPG. I don't want to role-play as a woman because I'm not a woman. I only want to role-play as a man. And then the next comments were just arguing about whether the game was an RPG or not. And I thought that was so funny. I know it's not actually funny. It's one of those things where it's like laugh or cry because this is so stupid. But man, I chose to laugh, I'll say. But anyway, my point is there are times where the criticisms are rooted in those things. If that is the case, then I think that they should be called what they are. That said, I do think that certainly publishing houses, Hollywood, there are a lot of companies that are just wanting to make money, and they don't actually care about representing different walks of life, different people, different experiences. They don't actually care about those things. They care about what's on trend because they want to make money. And as soon as your identity in some fashion is not in trend, they will drop it. And I think that's reprehensible. I think it's disgusting. I think everybody should aim to try to ensure that art is a reflection of all the different kinds of people that exist in the world. So, an example that I have seen of maybe what you're talking about, it's hard to say because it comes across a certain way, but I don't want to make assumptions. But something like the movie, oh my gosh, what's it called? That everybody hated with the really ridiculous song in it. Emilia Perez perhaps could fit into what is being described. That very much feels like Hollywood trying to pat themselves on the back for being such great beacons of progress, when in actuality there were so many people, trans people included, who really disliked that movie for a number of reasons. There were a lot of people who are Mexican who really disliked that movie for a number of reasons. And if somebody came along, especially if you have some kind of somebody that was involved in the movie trying to tell Mexicans why they're wrong for disliking it, or if you have people saying somebody is being transphobic for not liking the movie, even though they might be saying that at somebody who is trans, and the very reason they didn't like it is because they think it's a terrible representation of the trans identity and experience. I think that's an example of just calling somebody transphobic in that scenario, or calling somebody racist in that scenario, is a deflection of criticism. I think that's a way you could word that. But I think that we have to kind of look at things on a case-by-case basis. And sometimes people are just genuinely being racist, xenophobic, homophobic, sexist. Sometimes people are just being hateful in some fashion. Other times, I think that usually it's more so the people who created something, and they're all in their little circle applauding themselves for doing such amazing work, and they're getting the Oscar nominees. They're like, yeah, aren't we so amazing? All of us with our millions of dollars living lives that nobody else can even fathom or somewhat relate to. Aren't we all so amazing and progressive? And everybody over here is like, no, you're really not. Let me explain why. And they're like, ah. So while there are instances where I would discourage people from having these blanket statements, I also think I would not want to generally broad strokes say don't call something this if it very much is rooted in that. I really like this next one because it's bringing up something that I've absolutely seen before, but I've not really associated it with fandoms, and I'm not really seeing anybody else touch on this, but as soon as it was stated, I thought, oh my gosh, absolutely. It says, I don't like when fandoms try to explain anything away by saying the main character is in unreliable narrator. Unreliable narrators are a specific device, and there will be textual evidence if that is the case. I've seen many people across fandoms try to say a character is actually much better or worse than they are in the book, since the main character could perceive them in a biased way. There has to be actual evidence of this, or else anyone can just make up anything about the world or story. Edit. Things I appreciate are people adding perspectives I haven't thought about before. I also love reading different theories and hearing about foreshadowing that I missed. So I think it's kind of cute that at the end you're like, oh, I appreciate people pointing out things I might not have thought about before. And I started this by saying, oh, I really appreciate that you're pointing out something that I hadn't thought about before. This last one I think is a perfect way to sort of have a bookend on this conversation. It says, not so much a please stop as it is a please remember. Don't like, don't read. Ship and let ship. The block and mute buttons are your best friends, and appreciate all your fan work creators who do these things for free. And no, you are not entitled to these fan works either. That's it for a conversation about the pros and the cons of fandoms. If there's more you'd like to elaborate on, or if there are things that we didn't discuss here that you'd like to mention, feel free to do so in the comments down below. A big thank you again to Fable for working with me on today's video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.